Do you have a tough challenge with your supply chain or logistics? Loguru is the intelligent partner that works globally with manufacturers, retailers, and logistics businesses. We help our customers define, buy, and safely implement solutions across the supply chain. If you want a more sustainable future for your supply chain, visit loguru.co.uk. Complete end-to-end satisfaction guaranteed.
Coming up in this episode.
What led us to work together?
I've got an easy answer to that. It was a shotgun wedding.
Yeah,
I think
it was actually.
No other way to put it. And no, I think at the end of the day, it was exactly the right solution for the time.
The Logistics Collective podcast is a series focused on the logistics industry, where there are many incredible stories to be told. We'll be speaking with those who've worked and are working within the industry today. What have been their experiences, good and bad, since joining, and would they recommend a career in the industry to others? Here's your host, Malcolm Pope.
Welcome to a new Logistics Collective podcast, and in this episode we start a trilogy, remembering and perhaps lamenting the early days of e-sourcing in logistics. We're going to do this in 3 episodes or 3 chunks because that seems sensible. So the first episode, we're going to look at logistics e-sourcing and the initial sparks. And this will go all the way back to the very early part of this millennia, and maybe a little bit before. In the second episode, we're going to really cover from that initial spark to the value creation. And then finally, in terms of logistics e-sourcing, we're going to cover the future. We're going to think about the future and why we believe actually that the past informs it. Now, on this journey, it's a first for me to have a couple of people in on a podcast, and I've got 2 wonderfully creative and intelligent North Americans with me. In fact, US citizens with me, and I'm delighted to have them along. I have Paul Martyn and Tom Wahnsiedler. So first of all, hi Paul, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you've done?
Yes, thank you, Malcolm. It's a joy to kind of go down that memory lane together with regards to this project. It was one of the highlights so far of my career, and having sort of started my sort of e-sourcing journey in Pittsburgh at the time when free markets was kind of the dominant player. I was fortunate to join the startup company out of Carnegie Mellon University, owned by Dr. Sandville, that sort of pioneered sourcing optimization and its sort of use. And I've been now in the industry of procurement, right, wrong, or indifferently now since then. And so that was the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. So about 25 years in the industry. I've sourced on the transportation side of things. I calculated that this morning, just over $30 billion in transportation services over my sort of career, largely using sourcing optimization. I also covered the space of supply chain and logistics for Forbes for many years. It's a great joy to kind of be here with both of you.
Welcome to you, Paul. And as ever, nice to have a continuing connection. We do have occasional chats and interactions, and they're always value add.
Absolutely. We're both dog lovers.
Well, that's true. That's absolutely true. And food lovers, to be fair.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, if you ever want to go and see an amazing culinary journey, you just need to follow Paul Martyn on Facebook, and you'll get a whole load of things happening there. My next, I guess, interviewee or participant is a wonderful gentleman called Tom Wahnsiedler. And hello, Tom. And you give us an introduction and give us a little bit of background as well, if you could.
Okay. Hello, Malcolm.
Hello, Tom.
It has been a while, actually.
Yeah.
And one of the things that happened since we last spoke is I became a British citizen.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So
heavens.
No, that's perfectly all right.
Oh, no, we got one back.
Yeah. I now have 2 hats. My background is I'm a trained geographer and couldn't get a job in geography, so I did what all geographers do, is head for IT. I just finished my 40th year in the IT industry. I have had what I could only class as a completely unmanageable career. I started off in local government, then moved into FMCG, working for companies like Johnson & Johnson and Mars, then started a consultancy to do software support and development, and worked with companies like Cadbury's and Heinz, amongst other companies. And then spun off from that a logistics procurement software company, which is where the relationship began. Did that for a number of years, then moved into the property industry, and for a while ran such well-known websites as Win Location and Find a Property, and then moved into another property company, and then into a couple of social enterprises, and most recently back into property, where I've been working with a company based in Spain that does student accommodation. So, as I say, completely unmanageable and unmanaged career.
And that's absolutely fantastic. I'm not going to go and go on and drone on about my own career. It's probably well enough known by the listener anyway. What are your individual recollections of how we met? What's the first time? Can you remember?
I think you and I met at one of the launch events for Translogistica.
Yep.
I think that was the very first time we met. You came along and we presented our software, and you came up to me and you said, "I like this." And you didn't stop talking to me for years after that. So I guess you were being serious.
Yeah, I was. I mean, I was a younger man with a problem to solve, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But how about from you, Paul? What's your recollection? When do you remember?
Yeah, my recollection was as a sort of young professional who had zero logistics experience at the time. I was dispatched to Wigan, where the transportation group was based on ocean freight. And I remember walking in, was a factory. People, had all the safety gear on, and I sort of checked in, and they walked me into a warehouse, into an upstairs office that housed about 6 people. And you were in there meeting with the rest of the transportation team at the time. And I was in there actually for ocean logistics, ocean freight sourcing. And so I had worked with Barry and Steve at the time then, and they introduced me to you sort of in that conference room that dating us, I guess, here was smoke-filled, sort of old school sort of office. And it just struck me as being, a bit interesting after having worked with a number of Fortune 50 companies at the time, that the logistics team, was so well regarded and respected that they were tucked into a small office in a warehouse, sort of looking over the operations. So that was the first time that we met.
Fantastic. And I do remember both of those events. So I guess things sort of moved on. And what was the challenge in the back of my mind? Well, the first challenge really was that we knew a contract was coming to end. So that was the transportation contract for Heinz in the UK. And the sort of ambient and frozen contracts were coterminous. And so I had a big tender to do. But the second imperative in my mind was the former CEO of H.J. Heinz, which is Mr. Bill Johnson, had an edict. And his edict was every spend over $1 million had to use an e-sourcing platform. So in my mind, I thought, okay, great. Interesting. I like a bit of new tech. So let's really go and truly understand it. And from my background, I'd worked for logistics service providers before. So I got it from their side. But I also got it from, obviously, the customer side as well. So I've jumped to and from that divide on a number of times through my career. And I went out and looked at the technology. And there were noble and perfectly formed pieces of technology out there that bought things closer to commodity and simple services quite well. But my problem is that I understood the question. And if I hadn't have understood the question, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation now. And the question overall is that any distribution solution, if you're looking at value creation, a tariff is a part of it, but only a part of it. And to my mind, this was as much about risk management and optimization as much as anything else. So I did my trawl across what was available and out there, and I didn't get a full hit. I got a lot of misses in my view. A lot of what everybody else was excited about, I wasn't. Nothing new there. But what I was really seeking for is something that dealt with both that value and risk management together with how can we get a better answer. And then the organisations challenged me a little bit further and said, we don't like the way our rating mechanisms work, because it was a national distribution rate on a full truckload or pallet basis, and it had a number of flexes applied to it. And what the business wanted to get to was something that supported a closer to cost to serve model. And so we had to do a transformation from what wasn't cost to serve into something that supported cost to serve. And one of Malcolm's rules of tendering is you don't change the tariff across a tender, because you won't know where you've been, and you won't know where you're going to either. You won't know the handling characteristics as your business changes. So that was the broad problem. What led us to work together, do you think?
I've got an easy answer to that. It was a shotgun wedding.
Yeah,
I think
it was actually.
No other way to put it. And
sorry, guys.
No, I think at the end of the day, it was exactly the right solution for the time. I think we each brought something very unique to the party, in that we'd built a platform that let you ask for bids and for tenders, responses to your tender, exactly the way you wanted your questions answered. But we didn't have the analytical capability to really make the best of the answers you were getting back. And that was the other side of this wedding.
Yeah.
That was Paul.
That was Paul. And go on, Paul. You give me your view.
Yes, no, I would say, Malcolm, what I was tasked with was, as an American, again, dispatched to London at the time to sort of launch the U.S. operation for a startup technology company. I was looking for creative people who had a vision to do something that was different. The culture at the time was very much reverse auction oriented. And a lot of the sourcing people had in their employment contracts incentives, bonuses for how much they ran through reverse auctions. And so much about the sourcing culture at the time was around margin compression of suppliers through feedback. And we had sourcing optimization. We were looking for folks that were driven by value. And just in that first, hour in talking about the possibility of working together, I got really excited. And in fact, was one of the least profitable projects that we had in the company history, because we just got really excited about the vision that you had, and then some of the unique challenges of that project around the sole source aspect, the sophistication of the LSPs, and working with Tom and Translogistica around gathering a lot more information that we just didn't have a data collection tool to really support, but we had the analytical capabilities to complement what Tom was doing. And so just that combination of putting all that rich information together with the analytics is something that really sort of excited us, and I think that really sort of drove my enthusiasm, and sort of going back into the business that was not a very good salesperson at the time, and really making the case for why we should work on this. And also, H.J. Heinz was a early client of ours, so they were a client that pushed us. As you said, the CEO Bill Johnson pushed us to say, "Hey, listen, I want you to support the European business, not just here at Pittsburgh and the U.S." And so he really sort of pushed us to make a commitment to coming out there and working with you guys.
I think the other part of it was I had a boss at the time that gave me a pretty long leash, and that was utterly wonderful. And I'll give an absolute shout out to the wonderful Chris Clark, who I think anybody that's ever worked with him or worked for him would say that he's been a positive influence on their lives, absolutely, and still in contact, and he's still the sage, and still as amusing and occasionally irreverent, which I always adored and still do. I think to sort of scale this, if you looked at the total contract value, it was in the hundreds of millions. If you looked at the complexity in terms of number of locations, there were multiple locations, and also it was going through a period of change as well. So a new distribution centres being built, the normal sort of change and cycle that you had through a business. and also a change in the customer market whereby they were looking more and more at factory gate pricing as well. And so what you got was a situation of unsurety in terms of where is the future going to hold. The other aspect for me is that I'd been in those reverse auctions. I'd saw how people got so excited and, across half an hour or an hour's the auction, and you could hear the foam developing in people's mouths as they were getting more and more excited about watching a price go down. And yeah, absolutely fascinating. But when you were talking about buying something with so many moving parts and with so much risk involved in it if you got it wrong, it just seemed to be inappropriate. And for me, what I actually always wanted was the information and the analytical capacity and the optimizing capacity alongside what I would say human beings having a negotiation. That's what I saw. And it wasn't the sort of instant gratification of, hey, look at this, wow, we go into a room, we walk out of a room and we've saved money. But it couldn't be anything other than that. If you sort of looked at within that environment, cost of sales that logistics represented was probably in single figures, around the 4 or 5% mark. And whoopee, even if you save 10%, which was felt to be unlikely, I was told you'll only get 2% out of this. If you got it wrong, then that cost of disturbance and loss of sales and poor service would outweigh quickly in a matter of a couple of weeks in terms of the any savings that you may well have been able to generate. And so it's a different beast. And, the first sort of lesson learned is, hey, if you've got something different, use a different process to buy it. And I do wish even today that a number of businesses would focus on that, because I still see people doing it. The other fact is that tendering in the traditional way, which I had done earlier, was that logistics service providers don't want to answer your questions. And when they do answer them, you will get a variety of non-comparable formats of, here's my company brochure, here's our standard process for this or that. And, it was sort of like an oblique miss of every question that you were there. And so you had a big old table that you had loads of information on that you couldn't compare. Go on, Tom.
Well, that was exactly the historical route to Translogistica and the product that we built, because we knew that buyers wanted to ask particular questions and they wanted to get answers to them. But we also knew that logistics providers wanted the chance to sell what wasn't being asked about. So what we were trying to do was to build an environment where questions could be structured and you could compel an answer. You couldn't necessarily make somebody answer the question the way you wanted to, but they wouldn't be able to submit a bid unless they gave some kind of an answer to your question. But they also had the capability to add to that and say, you didn't ask about this, this, and this, but these are things that we can offer to add value to the proposal. And it gave you the capability then to incorporate that into your analysis, rather than saying, oh, that's very nice, and throw the paper over your shoulder and say, never really saw it.
Yeah, that would add on, Tom, that that was one of the reasons that made reverse auction so attractive, was that they codified what the item specifications were and only gave the suppliers the option of putting in a price. So it was apples to apples comparison. But a lot of times the flaw in that too was that the codification of the specifications were largely based on working with the incumbent or incumbents. And so they sort of formed that and became more of an exercise of heuristics. And the point, that the only option that LSPs sort of had at the time was to add things into an appendix, attach something to sort of the bid that way and hope that it was going to be considered. Because at the time for sourcing optimization, we used to make the case, let's bring this stuff in the appendix into the analysis so that you can begin to look at sort of a richer allocation. You can begin to be better sort of informed as far as that goes. And then also began to sort of bring best practices as to what other companies of like size, like industries have considered, have asked, and how you factor that into the analysis. And I think that's the beauty sort of sourcing optimization. It isn't so much, the solving aspect of things. It's really giving more flexibility to the suppliers in the way they submit proposals. And that flexibility, if you can help a supplier reduce the uncertainty, then they're less inclined to hedge. But if you're asking them to bid in a format that doesn't make sense with their business, or they don't know how to translate that,
True.
then they need to factor in on the price side of things a hedge for that uncertainty. If you can give them the assurances that their differentiation, their uniqueness, the way that they operate can be incorporated in the analysis, they're going to be a lot more aggressive in the way that they propose.
Are you talking about expressive bidding, or is my memory wrong?
No, you're exactly right. It went through many iterations brand-wise, but yes,
Yeah.
it is that. And I think, again, just kind of bringing that stuff from the appendix and how companies differentiate themselves and allowing the buyers to quickly and easily analyze that. Because if you think about the tool of choice for most sourcing people is spreadsheets.
Yep.
And they don't want to go through and program macros. And I've looked at hundreds of different spreadsheets and found thousands of errors in calculations in those spreadsheets that go undetected because they're buried in some sort of macro that when you've actually looked at the formula, you said, you're not actually getting what you desire from this. So being able to kind of dissect that stuff and get a lot of that information out of the desktops and spreadsheets and get it into a mature enterprise system that can be audited, can be fact-checked, et cetera. That sort of level of quality and assurance, also enhances the buyer's reputation because the suppliers know that they're not going to make mistakes, that they've worked with this particular technology, that they know that they can express themselves, in all the richness that they want to, especially as it relates to logistics. If you're buying pencils or pens or something like that, that's got a very simple specification, reverse auctions are a perfectly acceptable tool for commodities like that. But when you're talking about sustainability, and you're talking about the quality of the service, and you're talking about transit times, different modes, options in the network, there's a lot of that sort of richness that goes in addition to the tariff and the pricing that you want to consider, that are very important to that. I remember working with consumer goods companies that were really sensitive about the timing to their key clients and retailers. And they wanted to make sure that those things were extremely reliable on time. And they were willing to pay a little bit more for that sort of assurance. Whereas other lanes that were more internal, they had a little bit more flexibility as it came to the timing as far as that goes. So I think, looking at, especially at the time, capacity, things of that nature, very sort of important sort of analytics that support logistics.
I think the area that we were particularly keen to try to develop that I think CombineNet supported remarkably well was the notion that just because a company is asked to bid for a contract doesn't mean that they can optimally provide all of it. There may be parts of that will actually cost them so much money that they have to basically load cost onto the customer in order to bid for the whole thing. And what we wanted to be able to do is to provide a platform where they could bid for the bits that they could do really cost effectively and give best price on and not have to bid for the other parts.
Yeah, I would add to that too, one of the capabilities that we have in sourcing optimization is called XOR capacity. And what it looks at is to say that the logistics providers have a set number of trucks. If I have 10 trucks and you've got, 20 lanes you're putting out there, if you're putting me through a rigid RFP process, I have to guess which of these 10 lanes I'm going to bid on with my 10 trucks. Versus if I could submit pricing for all 20 and the optimization engine can determine, hey, you've only got 10, what's the best use of your 10 trucks on these 20 lanes? That kind of analysis really does give a lot more flexibility and takes the burden of guessing off of the suppliers. Again, reduce that uncertainty, and you're going to get more aggressive pricing.
Absolutely agree.
Yep.
I think the reflection on is that this was incredibly new. So it's certainly the first use and anger of Translogistica. And I think in the way with your business, Paul, in the way that this was used, whilst we had successfully used it with ocean freight, and that recovered a real conundrum of a challenge from the ocean freight basis. But I think we sort of engaged with you, and I think we stretched in several different directions, but I never felt that we actually we never got to the limit. It was almost that what we could have done was so far beyond what we actually achieved. But then, arguably, what we achieved was perhaps a little bit beyond the understanding of many of the participants and stakeholders within it. We will sort of come to that shortly, but you've got to think about this as that this was a couple of decades ago, and we were looking at this idea of expressive bidding. We were looking at bringing a factor of quality into the optimization of price, so that we were actually getting value out of this, that we were looking at pretty sophisticated balanced scorecards inbuilt to tools. And and part of the reason for me wanting to have this discussion, which we'll come through to, is that what exists on the market today is only a fraction of the capability of what was available 21 years ago. And that within the technology industry is, in my view, unusual. And I want to give, due shout-outs is that there were competing businesses within that arena, and there still remain competing businesses within that arena. But there was some unique qualities of this as a value-led and perhaps informed logistics buyer that I really appreciated that I didn't get elsewhere. Now, doubtless, I'd invite anybody to come and have that debate and tell me why I'm wrong. What did I miss? But I had a damn good look at everything that was available and on there.
But I would add, Malcolm, that I think that the timing is relevant now. As you look at like the Deloitte Chief Procurement Officer survey that comes out every year and has for quite some time, price as a priority for CPOs has always been in the top 2 or 3, except this year. This is the first year that price and cost savings was not in the top 3 priorities for chief procurement officers. And things like sustainability, things like quality, things like risk management have sort of eclipsed and are part of the value equation. Price is still important, don't get me wrong, but you're starting to see a little bit of change in the zeitgeist around looking at, as you talked about, more the value calculations, the value creation side of things, and valuing, the many different service options and differentiations suppliers have to offer that have not been considered in overly simple RFP processes.
Absolutely agree. And any sourcing process should really project forward in terms of how do you achieve value creation throughout the life of the engagement of that service or product that you're having. It can't just be a static target, because there is a need, a desire. It's essential for you to continue to improve always.
Excuse me, just relative to the logistics too, is that it's one of the areas of spend that can significantly influence the sustainability, your carbon footprint. And that is such an important sort of consideration and evaluation now. But companies struggle with how to analyze that. How do I collect the information from suppliers? Back to Translogistica, you want to look at the carbon footprint, you want to look at that. And then the analytics of, okay, well, how do I measure the trade-off cost of that? I don't want to put some arbitrary scorecard value on that to say it's worth 10% premium on that, because I don't know what the prices are. And so you'd much rather run the scenarios of looking at, hey, how can I go ahead and reduce my footprint by X? Where are the best options to do that from a cost effectiveness point of view? And using sourcing optimization to kind of help you understand the numbers and that trade-off cost is a very important dynamic when you're looking at your carbon footprint and how you go up. And I think to your point before, how do you communicate that to stakeholders? You don't want to go in there with your own personal opinion on that. You want to go in there with facts. And having run scenarios and look at trade-off cost, you can go into the executive suite and show them that your preference to do this is going to cost the organization $1 million. Is it worth it for the business case for the trade-off cost, not for hypothetical?
Absolutely agree. And I think as we go forward to the next episode, you will see the build from this, because it was by trying to form a more digitized approach to the procurement of logistics, by trying to get data in good order. There was a track there that said, if you can begin to do this across more and more, businesses, then there is an opportunity for us to optimize outside of the individual company silo. And that is possibly a point, I think, for our next episode. We're going to talk about the project itself, but in the final episode, I think we need to talk about potential perhaps not delivered and perhaps the reasons why, but most importantly, the result of that potential not being delivered gives us an even bigger challenge today. It's even more essential today to look at it. And if you're looking on a European basis, including the UK, I've got to say that these days, you're probably looking at empty running of goods vehicles and trucks of, 25% upwards. And that actually means that you're running around creating emissions and not earning any money as a result of it, or not earning enough money as a result of it.
The shocking thing is that is exactly the same situation as a decade ago.
Correct.
2 decades ago, probably 3 decades ago. It's not changed at all.
And I absolutely agree with you, Tom. My utter frustration is that the capability has been there for a long time. The intent just simply hasn't been. Where I describe it as Pavlovian logistics, Yeah, the light goes on, the LSP salivates, and there's no food in the bowl. And I don't think that's fair for the LSPs, because I know they do a critical and important job, and I would like them to become more profitable whilst offering their customers further value. And what that value means changes over a period of time. Paul, rightly you've mentioned that, okay, CPOs are beginning to get this, well, I've got to manage risk. I've got to look at total cost of ownership. I've got to have a more value-led view. And I spoke to Malcolm Harrison, who's CEO of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. And that was one of his key frustrations, that he says, look, we've got to get people into a value mentality, because it's absolutely key. And there's sort of an acknowledgement that not everybody's there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because in going down that value, you give more flexibility to the bidders, the suppliers in this particular cases, to give you many offers on a single item or lane. Whereas if you're too rigid on that and you give them just one option, again, they're sort of guessing as far as that goes. And one of my concerns, going back to kind of the spark and the design of this initial event, was that, Malcolm, you were going to award this to one winner. And that's one of the things that from an optimization point of view, we strongly discourage. You ought to look at every lane and say, hey, you want competition on as many of the lanes or items as is possible. And the idea that you were going out with one bundle, that you would award that to, from an initial design point of view, was a bit of a concern for me as far as just the market mechanism component of this. Now, as we get into the results and that kind of stuff, we'll talk a bit more about how this worked, and why it worked, especially as it relates to what Tom can speak about with just the richness of information that Translogistica could capture from each of these different LSPs in a way that then allowed us to create, in essence, many bids from a single supplier on this sort of package. And that sort of combination, manufactured some competition that we'll get into a bit more as we get through this.
Well, it's interesting because the very original seed concept for Translogistica was a bit different from what we ended up with, in that it was intended to be a marketplace, and a fairly open marketplace for both buyers and sellers of services, so that there could be 10, 15 tenders currently available that people could pick the bits that they could do most efficiently. And the buyers could say, well, if I pick from this, and this supplier, I'm going to save a lot of money because they're giving me a price that I can't get from any one of them to do everything. So our model was very much geared around the concept of a multiple partnership as the best solution.
I would also say too, the design-wise, what was interesting, as Malcolm, you talked about earlier, was this factory gate pricing sort of notion, where that created another analytical component here, where you had to go back to your clients, the retailers, and show them the rationale for why they shouldn't do that or they should do that. But that was another analytical factor in which we had competition from the retailers having a desire, to use their own negotiation power in the transportation markets to secure better pricing, on what was being delivered to them. And so that was another sort of dynamic in this marketplace from a design perspective that was very unique at the time.
And I would agree that. And on that note, I'm going to, we're going to have more to say in the next episode. I've always had the belief that to get perfection, you have to solve everything. You have to optimize everything. But on that note, I'm going to conclude this episode, and really thanks to Paul and Tom for participating. We've certainly hope you've enjoyed the podcast, and please look out for our next episode, which is the second in the series, which is logistics e-sourcing from the initial spark to value creation. Remember that you can access all of our logistics podcasts on logisticscollective.com. Please like and follow us, and we'll inform you when the next episodes are being published. We also publish on all of the common podcast platforms, including Spotify.
You can get in contact by email, podcast@logisticscollective.com, or leave a voice message on our website, logisticscollective.com. The podcast is a production by Le Guru.